something is substantively different about the scope and longevity and reach of this protest. It's not, in my view, it's not at all a departure, right? I mean, this movement builds on specific people and ideas that have been gesticulating since even before the Civil War ended. So there was a sort of, I would argue, a like consistent, ever-growing critical mass of people who are anti-sectarian, pro-reform, pro the parts of TAIF that have never been implemented, and so on. And that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the sort of status quo powers have to work a little harder each time to beat it back. And so this, in other words, isn't a transformative moment, but there is, it's larger than ever before. Yeah. And so the status quo powers have had to do more than they've had to do in a long time. Right. And eventually, either the status quo will just kill the country to stay in power, or they will have to change. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, and I'm a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. For the Lebanese who are living a life that's nearly impossible to live, it's not a game of points and increments. It's becoming can you keep your kids in school? Eventually it will come to the point of can you eat? Right. And so these are critical points.
What you're describing is 3 decades or potentially longer of frustration with how Lebanon emerged from the Civil War, and at least how it restructured itself, that this has sort of reached its limit. But would you be able to point the finger at the economy and say that is why people are demanding perhaps more now than they did before?
I've always believed that you have to factor in like multiple levels of motivation in understanding any of this. So there are people who argue it's only economic, and there are other people who argue it's only ideological or only about security. To me, it's obvious that it's all these things at once. Right. What has changed now is the economic calculus. Okay, so I just moved back to New York after 6 years in Lebanon, and I witnessed the last 6 years of decline. And for anyone who's known Lebanon intimately over the last 2 decades, you can see a steady, since 2000. I think there's a sort of high water mark in 2000 where the post-war recovery reached its peak, and there was a maximum of certainly livability, and how clean the environment was, how much things cost. Yes. In terms of security, yes, there was a Syrian occupation, but it was relative. That was a moment of relatively, after the Israeli occupation ended, there was a moment of, so you could sort of summer of 2000, you could say this is not bad to live in Lebanon. And since then, on every indicator, whether it's ideological, whether it's security-based, whether it's economic, health, social, everything has declined steadily. And I would argue that since the Syrian war, which has sapped and distracted a lot of the sort of underwater, like if you think of Lebanon as an iceberg, so there's all submerged things that the dark economy, the money laundering, all these things that make the country work without being measurable or fully exposed. All those things are under colossal strain or distraction, including the black economy and the Zaim economy, and so life has worsened in very observable ways. And so when this economic crisis hit in the fall, that is, one, it's an order of magnitude different, right? You go from creeping poverty, creeping inability to function, to suddenly not being able to access your money, not being able to do things that even in the middle of the 2006 war you could do. And that's coming on top of everything being awful for years and years and years.
The reason I brought up the economy was because although it is horrible at the moment and it continues to decline, the demands on the street for political change seem to stand out in dramatic ways. When I bring up political change, I mean it seems like there's an attempt to upend the post-war order and perhaps usher in a new social contract. Whether or not that happens is a big question. But it almost seems like the economic collapse has brought about demands that are absent in previous protests or marginalized.
Yeah, so I don't quite see it that way because I see all these economic problems as these are political decisions. So every single thing wrong with the Lebanese economy, or if you look at something as sort of technocratic as building permits in Beirut, or it's all completely political.
Yeah.
And we all know this. We all know that these decisions are being made for political gain by the Zuama and their associates.
Yes.
So. In the end, whether you're talking about garbage pickup in 2015 or whether you're talking about uninhabited rental apartments in Beirut, as housing activists have been for decades, these are all purely political questions, and every Lebanese understands instinctively that these are decisions being made by these relatively unaccountable leaders for political purposes, and they feel this way when they agree with the decisions and when they have problems with the decisions, and that is correct.
Right.
And ultimately, when we see any kind of crisis be resolved in Lebanon, it's always resolved because a small group of men meets at Nabi Berri's house, and some crisis, whether it's security in Tripoli or Saida or some piece of the economy that's going off the rails, the wheat producers or the gas importers, a small group of men can join together in the speaker's office and make anything happen. And so this proves to any observer of Lebanon that these are political choices, political decisions, not economic decisions.
So in other words, what could have just been a natural decline in the economy instead is a political calculation that backfired.
Yeah, a series of crises provoked by political decisions, and in this case, they backfired. And in other moments, similar moments in the past, the housing bubble almost exploded a few years ago, and they were able to sort of paper over the Ponzi scheme and make it work, and that was a relief to people, not because they were regular Lebanese weren't profiting from this. They just wanted the lira not to collapse.
Now, I'm quite fortunate because I got to attend a panel discussion that you were part of at LAU New York. And although we were probably at least 15 meters apart, now we're half a meter apart because one of my microphones seems to have broken. So we're very intimate right now. I'm going to ask you more intimate questions than the panel discussion.
Fantastic. Ask away.
Without crossing the personal line. So let's keep it political.
Ask whatever you like.
So I like the dynamic of the sort of. It wasn't necessarily a debate. It was more just trying to understand one part of the last, let's say, at least 30 years of inability for Lebanon to emerge from the civil war into a sovereign state, the way we understand that. In other words, that there have been structural components within the post-war order that have not allowed the state to function the way Lebanon functioned, let's say, at least in the 50s or the 60s. And the discussion hovered around Hezbollah and other things too. I know that you've written a book, A Privilege to Die, that focuses in on Hezbollah's role in Lebanon and the region. But I wanted to ask you your views at this moment in time. I like that you talked about many, many things that Lebanese are rightfully upset about, whether it's electricity, garbage, drinking water, or education for their children, all of those things that don't really tie into Hezbollah. They're a separate story. But I want to posit the question. Is it possible to imagine Lebanon at some point in the future functioning? And I'm using this term as loosely as possible, where it's not continually collapsing in different ways, where it's not reaching where it is today, so long as there's a group like Hezbollah involved in the story, not necessarily in the trash crisis, not necessarily in electricity, or even in the basic elements of day-to-day life. I'm talking about the Lebanese state as a whole. And I mean this in the broadest way possible.
Right. Well, so if I understand your question correctly, I mean, one way of answering it is to say that, Hezbollah as a hybrid actor, as a sort of parallel state, is a symptom of the state collapse, and after a time also a driver, right? The basic solution to the Hezbollah question and many other questions is simply to have a better functioning Lebanese state, a central state that can actually do its job. Yeah. And some people will, I think, with some correctness, argue that now Hezbollah is one of the entrenched actors that will subtly resist the reconstitution, let's say, of the Lebanese state. And I think that's partly true, but Hezbollah's role in this gets greatly exaggerated by its detractors. So I'll give you my shortest possible answer on this. You can ask me more if you're interested. I think all the Zu'ama have a stake in Lebanon functioning as a war economy. So Lebanon is a war economy that is functions to the benefit of predatory warlords and their warlord economies. And ultimately, that system is so enriching and effective that it even captures those groups that did not begin as warlords. So, for example, Hariri came into power not as a warlord. He was a post-war figure who was, neoliberal and the rest of it, but he was not a warlord. And yet, within a decade of his rise to power, he was a firmly entrenched part of the sort of warlord economy, the Zaim economy.
So the post-war economy is the issue.
Well, I don't think it's the post-war economy. It's the Lebanese economy. I think I believe that a lot of these terrible pathologies predate the Civil War, and they caused the Civil War, right? So you had a group of mafia bosses who ran extractive sort of mafia-style protection rackets and extractive schemes. They treated the national economy as something to be profited off of through monopoly powers or unfair concessions and earned through wasta or sectarian set-asides. And that ultimately was so profitable to the leaders that they preferred to wreck the country through a civil war, and around which they mobilized people on sectarian identity rather than any, including Kamal Jublat's attempt to mobilize people on some other set of identities, and there were others too who tried to stick to their non-sectarian or more than sectarian identities. Ultimately, that was the most profitable model.
I'm going to try to project here that going back to, let's say, the late 60s, early 70s, that you would not discount the PLO's security component. You would just add.
I think the PLO fit in that model. Right?
So it fits in the model.
Yes, okay, I think the PLO approach, in fact, at its peak, exemplified the model. And if you look at Lebanese history over the last, let's say, 4 decades, you'll see. There was a point at which Fatah was the dominant, para-state. Then there was a period where Jaja's, the Lebanese forces were the dominant parallel state. Today, the single strongest version of this is Hezbollah. Simply because they're the strongest and wealthiest and most powerful of these groups. Their model is essentially a successor of this approach. Now, we definitely can see ways in which it is distinct from these other groups. I don't mean to say that they're all the same. Hezbollah is not the same as Amal, as Jumblat, as Future, and so on. There really are differences, but the key difference right now is just that they're the most powerful group. And we have.
So it's not how they emerged after the Civil War with protected status. You would put the economy as paramount to the story.
No, the economy's not. The economy's. It's not that the economy is paramount. It's this mafia model is what's paramount. And Hezbollah comes out on top in the period they come out on top because of Syria's protection, because of Syrian Iranian patronage, and because all the rival groups disarmed after Taif and a confluence of other factors, right? So they end up becoming the dominant group. And yes, part of the story is their ideology, which is more popular with their followers right now than the other groups' ideologies with their followers. Right. And we also have to put this into the story. Israel was occupying Lebanon up until 2000 and then has continued to attack periodically since. And many other parties don't actually care, right? So that's, some parties do, some don't, but it is a real part of the story.
It's interesting. I like going back to that chapter in history because it's overlooked, I think, that how significant of a moment that was. Not just in the economic.
You mean 2000 and the Israeli withdrawal?
1999, 2000, yeah. And I distinctly recall the Syrians being the most upset at that withdrawal.
Their raison d'être is challenged by the end of the enemy.
And Hezbollah was the only security force that could operate in South Lebanon in those years, up until 2006, up until following the July War. So the reason I'm pushing on this is I mean I haven't heard this before actually, that in other words they are on top because they are the most powerful, but they fit into the long-standing model, which is a nice way of looking at it.
They've become, no one can escape becoming Lebanese when they're in power in Lebanon.
Right. But doesn't that, in a sense, discount their military component to a degree, at least? And what I meant from the initial question was that they are able to perhaps dictate or at times derail attempts at Lebanese sovereignty, and whether or not that is a precondition for fixing the mundane issues. So
maybe, and just to make clear what my view of all this is. So I just sort of gave the on the one hand, but then here's the on the other. Hezbollah is preeminent because it uses violence to maintain its monopoly of power, and it has very brilliantly kept a monopoly of power while having its partners do most of the governing. So it can have Amal and FPM as its, they say, they're the ones who are doing the bad governance, not our fault, but they are the power behind these parties, and they have murdered dozens of figures, yes. and going back, at least to 2005, and that is something, again, everyone in Lebanon knows. It doesn't matter that, they say, we haven't been convicted, these things aren't, it's not a historical fact. Well, if you're Lebanese, whether you're pro or anti Hezbollah's sort of hegemony, you know that they either did those killings or condoned them, and that is a coercive power that is not lost on the Lebanese order, and it is something that is responsible for holding back real reform. And so this translates to today's moment, where if you are a young activist, you know that very easily you could find your family blackmailed into silence, you could find yourself detained on a pretext, you could find yourself, they don't go around killing young activists because they don't need to, not because that would somehow be beyond their moral or political toolkit. They have a better tool to shut people up. And apologists for Hezbollah will say, no, the others are no better. And that may be true, but the others aren't in charge right now. The others aren't the ones with the power. They are the ones with the power, and they are the ones who are underwriting an increasingly authoritarian order inside Lebanon.
So in a way, that's nice because you're able to see both sides, and they may both add up to the same issue, which is the economy matters for reasons, and the political order is a result of certain reasons as certain issues.
And the security calculus is not a tool of that. It is a building block of this. It is fundamental to it as well.
Projecting a bit, can you see attempts at reform, like what we saw the last 4 months, translate into a challenge towards at least that security issue? And because were you there during? You were were you here or in Lebanon during the?
I left Lebanon a week before the protest started in the fall.
So you literally saw what was.
I was talking to everyone. Everyone I talked to was talking about their economic terror at this crisis that everybody saw coming. Absolutely. And then it happened like clockwork a week later, which is astounding.
That week, and we look back on it, it's like every trigger possible happened. That feeling of anxiety and uncertainty, and then you see an outpouring of rage. Fast forward 4 months, potentially 5 months, or even, let's say, a year or 5 years from now. Is that rage politically sustainable and translatable to something that could address the economy and the security issues of Lebanon?
So,
and I know it's a huge question, but just in your,
my analytical take is that it's very hard to unseat this status quo arrangement. It is resilient, it is versatile, it is unscrupulous, it has it has the advantage of all the resources of the state, which it gets, even while not being a state, it gets to use all those resources of the state, including amnalam and economic levers and many other things besides, to keep power and to suppress dissent. And, as we've seen in the current moment, it's easy for these kinds of, like, if you have power and you actually don't care at all about the citizenry and you don't care at all about governance, which none of these parties do, including Hezbollah, you can just wait it out. And if you really actually don't care about the moral hit to your legitimacy, it's actually not a bad bet to bet on just waiting. And this is, it's not exactly analogous, but this is what the Iraqi status quo has done in the face of an amazing, brave, bold, very national level. Very similar to Lebanon's, but on the much larger scale that Iraq's is, and where they've been killed in the hundreds, and they keep coming back. And the status quo says, again, not a bad bet. They say, we're not even going to try. We're not going to answer their, everyone knows all the stuff the protesters are saying is true, and we're just going to sit here unashamed, and eventually they'll go home in a year, in 2 years, because it's just, people are poor, people have jobs. It's very hard to prove the counterpositive. Like, how are these protests going to change the system? And eventually, the system will be the victor. So
in a way, you see the system able to ride out this moment as well. That it is able.
So analytically, I think they have the advantage. Yeah. But there's a couple of things. Mercifully, there's a couple of things riding against them. And so my preference, I want the system to change. It's an awful system. It's a terrible, there are worse, right? Active civil war is worse than this, and that's sort of the Zuama gun to all our heads. Like, if you force me to change, I'll kill myself and you along with me. And that's that's the blackmail of terrible governance. So the two main things that are to the advantage of reformers right now is that it just doesn't work anymore. There's not enough money left. There's not enough juice left in this broken system to feed this mafia machine that I referred to. And they might yet find a workaround. They might even provoke low-level conflict as a way of blackmailing people into submission or actually making more money, because these war economies generate money. But when there's no gas in the tank, pick your metaphor, it doesn't work anymore, they might just have to change whether they like it or not. So that's
changing, meaning coping.
No, I mean real change.
Oh, real change.
No, coping and adapting is in the current system is not reform or change, right? That's the status quo,
right?
And that's the so the safe bet is that they'll find some way to maybe make a cosmetic change, maybe give up 10% of the power they have, but basically keep the same deal going,
right?
But it's possible that they just won't be able to do it because the Jumblats and the Hariris and the Hezbollah cronies and the Amal people won't be able to make any more money governing this way. And they'll just in a way disappear in the same way. Like, if you look at what happened after Taif, there was a whole web of local bosses who were associated with the different factions, and they had their power because of the explicit or implicit threat of force they had. So they, over their community, over their neighborhood or town, they could do whatever they wanted.
These were largely byproducts from the 80s. And
they were the local boss of this or that militia. Yeah. As soon as those militias no longer were militias, those figures, many of them just vanished, or they became business interests or party hacks with some power, but nothing like what they had before. Yeah. And in a similar thing, we'll talk at length, maybe even right now, about Hezbollah's real legitimacy, its legitimacy that it gets simply from the backing of Iran and Syria and so on, how much of it comes from the threat of force and whatnot. As a thought exercise, if the foreign policy of Iran changed and they stopped giving major weapons to Hezbollah and just gave money, the whole equation would change overnight, right? And so for all the talk of what is the unique special sauce that Hezbollah has that keeps, if they didn't have the huge military backing, they would be a very important political movement. They would have legitimacy, they would have a following, and they wouldn't be able to dictate the political order the way they are now. Right. And that's not because of something they have that's miraculous. It's because they get this incredible military and economic support from abroad. And 30 years ago, when the LF was getting that, they were incredibly influential and important, right? When they had, when they had foreign powers flooding them with tanks and real weaponry that allowed them to dominate the country, they mattered more than anybody else. And as soon as that was cut off,
I'm not going to disagree with it, of course, but I mean, the LF in the 80s is a very different beast than Hezbollah today. I think even in terms of economic dependence as well.
Sure, I don't. But the thing that I want to say is when you looked at the quasi-state they built, it seemed unassailable, and then it was gone. And I don't mean to make an equivalence. I mean, Hezbollah will always, I think, be like one of the most well-organized and cohesive parties in Lebanon. So, if Iran pulled every dollar from Hezbollah would continue to be incredibly important. They just wouldn't have what they have now, and they wouldn't be able to dictate what the limits of a reform project are. And that does lead to like the other piece of this puzzle. If you really want to change Lebanon's formula, it's not going to happen with all the people against all the parties. Some of the one or two of the parties is going to have to jump ship and join the reform demand, which is unlikely, but it is possible because they'll see it as
survival,
or even a way to be preeminent. Some years ago, I would have thought that FPM and Hezbollah would be the candidates for that.
Actually, I was going to bring that up. I heard that in the discussion. It was a shared opinion, I think, by everyone, with the exception of Nadeem as the moderator. But I don't recall that kind of reflection on the FPM and Hezbollah in 2007, 2008 as the... I know that's what they were saying, and I remember that being a very persuasive argument as the opposition, and the less corrupt, actually by default, the less involved politically in FPM.
Well, and they were often, I mean, at that period they were less corrupt because they had less power. So before they took the seats to be corrupted, they were by definition less corrupt because they didn't have access and money. And as soon as they did, especially the FPM, But I'm curious.
Sorry,
go ahead.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But what was your? I mean, because I think you said it in a way that it didn't resonate immediately. Which is what were you seeing from their side that made you think that they were the ones to sort of usher in a better politically a better state for Lebanon?
So in hindsight, one could say it was obvious it wouldn't turn out this way, but at the time, at the time of the marriage between FPM and Hezbollah, and at the time when Hezbollah and FPM were publishing platforms with
so this is that 2007 period where it's just
this already goes back to when Aoun returned in 2005 and published an actual reform platform for the FPM, and he hadn't yet so lots of people I talked to at the time said, don't trust this person. There's no way. But there were a lot of people I met and interviewed who were just rank and file people who believed, and these are not powerful, important people. These are just regular Lebanese, lots of Christians, lots of Shia, who believed that their two parties were going to engage in a anti-sectarian reform project, and that their two leaders, the leader of the FPM and the leader of Hezbollah, were the only political party leaders in Lebanon who were not hereditary leaders. They weren't there because their fathers gave them the seat. They weren't planning to give it to their son. Again, this is 10 years ago. This is pre-Basil and all these. But so the point is, there was a certainly believable to some Lebanese idea that these parties were going to change the system. Election processes were going to be reformed so that you would have a real, proper parliamentary system with a real secret ballot, universal suffrage, no longer these sort of easily manipulated elections. And I found that at the time to be plausible, in part because I think from Hezbollah's perspective, they knew they would do even better under a reform system. So they weren't proposing reforms because they wanted to reform themselves out of power. They were proposing reforms because they thought, the more broad-based elections were, the more votes Hezbollah was going to get.
Right.
So that's why at the time I thought it was a long shot but possible. Today it's not, because I think all the parties, including Hezbollah, see real meaningful reform would be bad for all of them.
Right.
There's no longer.
But that hereditary story is interesting because that has happened in other situations, but those two examples do stand out, and I think it's quite telling when you hear on the streets even today the chants. They're against generations of the same families. But those two are really not. They stand out still. Although, I want to get your take on this. The phrase "killun yani killun," which still is said, although maybe it's not as emotional as it was 4 months ago. Do you think that literally means the post-war civil war structure and everyone involved? Or is there still an exception? Meaning, does that party have special status, period? A special thank you to everyone listening to the Beirut Banyan podcast. And these episodes are made possible by the generosity of listeners like you. Kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. Patreon is a monthly subscription. You can donate as much as you'd like and cancel anytime. And PayPal is a one-time contribution. Any amount is appreciated. And now back to our episode with Thanassis Cambanis.
Hezbollah has a special status because of its coercive power. The real special status it has is that it alone among all these parties has the power to shut you up either through discrete pressure or through outright violence, and it has used that pressure, and everybody knows it. So that is different. And now all these warlords are the worst. They're awful, right? And for sure, most of the people I know who have personally suffered oppression for voicing political dissent in Lebanon are being persecuted by thin-skinned FPM leaders and not by Hezbollah. Okay, so when you actually add up who's being called in for questioning by military intelligence for like a blog post, it's almost never someone who criticized Hezbollah. It's like a non-sectarian person who's not part of a party who dared to criticize Jaja or more likely Basil. And I mean, the Jaja thing is interesting too, because there are people who've been hauled up for criticizing Jaja, and you say, why? What's in it for him? And my sense of this is that all these warlords are trying to police their fiefdoms. So the biggest threat to them is independent voices. They actually do not mind, like, if a Hezbollah supporter were to criticize Jaja, no one would care on TV. But if a independent journalist, especially someone who confuses sectarian boundaries, what if it's a nonpartisan Shia who criticizes many parties and then criticizes, a member of the Zuama, that kind of person is a big threat, because it suggests that you can exist outside of the sectarian order. Whereas if you're a Sunni nationalist or a Christian nationalist, you're playing a part that's very comfortable. So even if you're attacking another party, you're reinforcing the order in which you need your sectarian zaim to be, to protect you against this outside force. So to your question of the special status, I have felt, even since the garbage protests, that there are a lot of Lebanese who really do mean kilun yani kilun. They do not reserve. So they will say, like, someone needs to protect us from Israel, fine, but that is no longer an excuse for Hezbollah's corrupt use of national electricity for its own benefit without paying for it, and so on. They might not be the worst of the lot, but they're not immune. They're part of this. Pinata of the treasury and of
these
the
are
nation
supporters of
Hezbollah, right? So those people exist, but they won't. They cannot easily make a big public position about this, because there's a very direct cost. And honestly, if you're them, if you think this movement's not going to work, what's the point? Like you're going to destroy your life in order to make a symbolic stand, and in the end, the current arrangement of power stays the same.
It's almost able to see that this will not last.
Yeah, because otherwise you could. Think about this: are there ever going to be a bunch of people from Khandak al-Ghamik who are going to go and march on the speaker's house and say, like, we've been, doing as you ask for generations, and we are still mired in poverty. Enough is enough.
Yes.
Do something. Try to imagine that scene. That scene's not going to happen.
I fully agree. And at the same time, the first few days, it seemed like that was happening to a point. And that's really what stood out to me. It's those first few days where that was plausible unexpectedly.
I think it would happen the moment a reform project becomes tenable. So people aren't dumb, and people aren't reflexively sectarian or obedient. So like when and if there's a real chance for change, there will be plenty of people from Khandak al-Ghamik, there'll be Sunnis from Tariq Jadida, there'll be Shia from the Dahiya, and so on, who will support any number of excellent initiatives that are not led by their traditional leaders.
Yes.
But until those things are viable, they're not going to jump into the forefront of these things, and they're certainly not going to sort of attack as false idols the shibboleths of their parties, because there's no percentage in it for them. Some of them quietly still do, and many of them quietly, if you talk to them off the streets, will have extensive and very nuanced critiques of what's wrong with the system.
I sense that they're able to be nervous about criticizing the respective leadership, and at the same time willing to suggest that it's time that they pack up. So it's almost like both could happen in the same person, that they know why they're not able to fully embrace a revolution, but at the same time they're able to see why they've reached this point. It's almost like an awareness of why we're here, and at the same time cannot go all the way. It almost seems like a psychological barrier was fractured, maybe broken a bit, but it didn't fully collapse in October.
Well, and one thing to think about, so, in Lebanon, it seems almost like an impossible destiny to overcome this, the muhassasa, right? The fact that we're going to always have a Shia speaker and a Sunni prime minister and a Christian president, but, there's no reason, based on Lebanon's history or the region's history, to think that that's somehow going to go on forever. It could go on forever, but 1 year from now or 10 years from now, there could be a Lebanese nationalist in power who is from the wrong sect for his or her office running the country, and then people will say, "Oh my God, it was inevitable that this broken system would be subsumed by a national movement where some figure who was able to rally Lebanese around, probably not a kumbaya, lovely liberal project, but around some kind of other project, and because these kinds of political transformations happen again and again in history, and they've happened again and again in the Arab world and in the whole world, right? The Arab world is not somehow a departure or an aberration from human history. It's part of a continuum of political history and transformation. So when and if that happens, so everyone accepts the possibility that Lebanon could collapse into war again someday, and I think many of us think it's unlikely, but that possibility is always on the table as a possibility. And I would say it should be, and you know what else should be on the table? That a new type of leader will emerge.
I like that delineation, and I think that's a perfect way to touch on a more recent subject which you've been writing about, and I'm glad that I now have my personal copy, Citizenship and its Discontents. You're in a way touching on the birth, or perhaps, I don't want to sound too romantic, but the rebirth of what it means to be Lebanese. That there's a citizen component to the story. There's an identity there. I don't think it existed this way in the past, and it may transform into something else. But clearly a citizenry, or flickers of citizenship, were on display. And it was great to see for the first time a genuine sense that we want to get rid of the old order. And as somebody who's seen previous attempts at change, those few weeks, that initial stretch was very, 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 it was beautiful. And don't know what a Lebanese citizen is even until today. I don't know what it means to be Lebanese. I think it's a very open question, and I think that's a good thing. I think the more universal the answer, the better. I don't think it has to be confined. But I want to touch on the issue of pluralism and the way Lebanon stands out when it comes to the region. The intercommunal regime that Lebanon inherited and modified to a point, that thing that we all live with, which you were talking about, that seems to cope or seems to get by, whether it's periods of war, periods of peace, periods of instability like today. It may even contribute at times to it for its own survival. But the other side of the story, which is among the more tolerant parts of the Middle East, and Lebanon has had some breathing space, which other countries may have had a little earlier and don't have today. Is there any defense in your mind, or any persuasive argument, that the intercommunal arrangement Lebanon has, this power-sharing mechanism, that it is salvageable, it can be reformed, and that maybe that is the model Lebanon should keep? And the other side being that the secular state, which many people are calling for, which I consider myself one of those people, wanting a secular state, wanting a civil state, that I might be wrong in wanting that.
Well, I don't think you're wrong in wanting it.
Okay.
So that is the question. That's sort of the central question of how what kind of future one can imagine. And I have a couple of thoughts in response to what you said, and I think you beautifully summed up the dilemma. So one, for starters, yeah, the default assumption is that the current order continues, right? That is in any field of human endeavor. Past performance is the best predictor of future performance. Not the only one, but probably that's what's going to happen. Some version of the Ottoman millet systems ethos as it has manifested in a confessional Lebanon. So yes, that is probably the way some version of that is what will unfold. And yes, in that framework, under that umbrella, things could be less bad than they are. But for me, I think that system, a system in which people's rights are based on their religious identity as defined by clerical authorities, is always going to be a bad kind of regime to live under. Now, there are worse ones to live under, and this is its defense. The defense of this is that Lebanon is the last remaining country in the Middle East where there is genuine diversity and demographic pluralism, and in which no one community has dominated, erased, and wiped out the other.
Right.
Okay, so that's it. There's no other place where you have different religions and ethnic groups that have been able to preserve communal autonomy and avoid erasure or full suppression by some majority. Right. And that is important. That's a great thing, right? The alternatives are worse. You don't want to be, an Iraqi Christian or a Palestinian under Israeli occupation or so on.
Turkish Armenian or whatever.
Turkish Armenian or an Egyptian Copt today, right? These are all these categories of people are second-class citizens at best in the nations they live in. So Lebanon's alternative is better than that. But your rights are based on whatever your sect is, and as defined by your sect's leaders. So you don't even get to say what kind of, who you are, to what extent being a Sunni, let's say, is instrumental to who you are. And the way people live, in actuality, people marry, inherit, and so on. There's no room for it in this rigid system. And there's no room for things like civil marriage. There's also no room for rights and due process. And this is the problem of the formulation of the sectarian state or a secular state. And so what I posit is, and not everyone agrees with this approach, I say we have to stand for universal rights. And if universal rights are properly enumerated, they carve out room for everybody's identity. Okay, so the wrong approach is French laïcité, right? In which you are you're enforcing a version of secularism that one part, it's one cultural brand of secularism, and you say that's our state religion, and you may not wear a headscarf, and you may not wear a cross around your neck.
In other words, the Turkish model.
Yes, which is it's even the same name, right? Like leak was what Ataturk called it. So that is not the only alternative to a confessional system. Another alternative is universal rights. Universal rights include freedom of religion. You just can't have freedom of religion that eclipses my freedom to live the way I want.
Right.
So that means you can't have certain communal authorities, and that would be a loss of power for clerics in Lebanon. On the other hand, properly enumerated and enforced, you'd be free to be as religious as you want.
Yeah.
Okay. You just can't. You can't say that we have a Maronite, right to the head of the army and a Orthodox right to the central bank job, but you can
Maronites as well.
Oh, that's Maronite. Riyad Salam is a Maronite. I thought he was Orthodox. I'm so disappointed. So it's a hard. It's a hard idea to like imagine how that works in practice, but it's a radical break, and one has if you're promoting this, you have to locate this in Arab history, right? Because the counter argument is, this is some kind of European import, and what I'm talking about isn't. I'm talking about the Arab idea of universal rights, which has existed as a current of Arab political thought for centuries. And it's not up to me to say what the Arab world should do, but that exists as a indigenous idea, and it's no less legitimate than indigenous religious ideas.
But let me ask you, what is? I mean, we're looking back. I know at a long period of time, but at least the 20th century, when it comes to modern Middle East history, just the basic idea of inclusion, which is in the subtext of your book. Why has it been such a struggle for minorities, religious communities, to feel fully invested in their governing structure? And I know that Lebanon has endless problems. I know Lebanon has at many points failed in finding a way forward together. But despite all the existential flaws within Lebanon, it does feel like every community has its place in this dysfunctional situation. And you look at the region.
That's right. Every community has its place, and if you don't like that place, too bad for you.
Exactly. Right.
You got to stay. You've got to stay in that place.
Right.
And so why has it been so awful? It's been so awful because there's been, in the 20th century, we had wave after wave of fascism, totalitarianism, and majoritarianism. These were some of the most successful, vibrant ideologies of recent history. So we have not seen, in other places, in Indonesia, the Islamic forces manifested themselves largely in political movements that embraced plurality of religion. Okay, and so why did that happen? I mean, there's different history, different reasons, but there's nothing about Islam that makes it go in some bad way. However, in the Arab world in the 20th century and in recent times, what we've had is several waves of toxic majoritarianism. Ikhwanism, Takfirism. We've had the Iranian Revolution's version of Shia eschatology and end times, messianic fervor. These are not universal ideas, but they have been very dominant at this period of history, and they've been very destructive.
Yes.
Okay. So the actual
it's the fate of Lebanon that it kind of was shielded enough from that.
Lebanon was shielded by the happy accident of its demographics.
Right.
No single group, and groups tried. Right. I mean, there's some very chilling moments in Lebanese history, including during the Civil War, and even in more recent times, where various groups have tried to have their way. Happily, they can't because they don't have the numbers. And that's been the saving grace. It's not. I don't think so. Some Lebanese argue differently. I don't think it's because of some majesty in the Lebanese formula that inoculated it against toxic and poisonous ideas. It's that the numbers didn't work, and so any would-be tyrant has been unable to impose themselves.
That's interesting. So otherwise, in a projection or prediction, otherwise it would have just ended up like the rest of the region.
I mean, like another. So it could have ended up like Syria, okay,
Right,
where
yeah.
you don't have you don't exactly have a sectarian rule, and you have a dictatorship that has essentially a political ideology and a family, one family's preeminence as the core of its its sort of philosophical right to rule the whole country. That's not, so they're not there because they're Alawite. They're there because they won and they were merciless in their exercise of power. Something like that could have happened in Lebanon. You could imagine a turn of events where one or another warlord had succeeded at conquering the whole country, and then who knows what sort of national idea they would have forged to legitimize themselves. That could have happened. I'm glad that didn't happen. That's one of those alternatives that would have been worse, right? That's a non-sectarian alternative that would be worse than today's jerry-rigged pluralism.
Right.
Okay, and that is what one of the things we think about when we think about reforming Lebanon. And I thought about this very hard when I was living there and watching people I really admired. After the garbage protests and these really brave and wonderful civil society activists from all over the country trying to imagine how to take their country forward.
Yes.
And the powers that be were actively threatening to provoke violent civil strife if they were pushed too hard to reform.
Yes.
Which is unconscionable and awful, but there they were doing it. And if you're, I'm only was observing this as a resident alien, but if you're the reformer, and even if it's blackmail, you don't lightly push your country to the brink of sectarian conflict, even if you know it's avoidable and not your fault, right? But and yet that is such a real cost that and decent people don't want to be held responsible for that, even if it's not their fault. And I think that is a disadvantage for reform movements, but it's also an advantage for them because they really they are understood or can be understood to really be invested in the best outcome for the country and not in wealth and power for themselves and their parties.
Right.
And that is something that distinguishes them. I don't know what that leads to, though. I mean, this is a real conundrum because you can't develop. I mean, this is one of the problems that the reformists everywhere have in these very oppressive power equilibria. You can't come up with a new governing formula from the outside. Okay, the new a new identity, a new national compact has to be forged by people in power. Ultimately, any new, whether it's Gamal Abdel Nasser founding it as he, takes over on the back of a tank or, whatever. These are, again, not usually good outcomes, but transformative processes are negotiated from within the halls of power.
Which is in a way admitting that despite the best intentions and motives of the average protester, these parties or these figures are here to stay regardless. That, in other words, that there's only so much removing of the structure you can do. And
I mean, you have, in the dream scenario where change happens, it will happen because some of these reformers end up in positions of power.
Right.
And then once they're in positions of power, they can and will negotiate some new modus vivendi, hopefully a better one, right? Where they will bring in these ideas about citizenship instead of identity as the driver of the Lebanese governing compact and change the relationship between the state and the citizenry.
But do you sense that is happening at the core of all of these protest movements, including Iraq and potentially Iran, that what we're seeing now is a transition towards something?
I think in Lebanon, for sure, we've seen these ideas articulated more than in any other place that I'm intimately familiar with,
right?
Because there's been decades of civic activism by people. And by the way, this thing I just said about these things having to be changed within the halls of power. A lot of the people involved in the protest movement are rich and powerful people, right? They're not only disenfranchised people, and that's important. That's good. That's a good thing.
That's actually the magic of the moment, that it cuts across many different lines. Yeah.
And so when you have people with no power and members of the elite together over, in the case of Lebanon, at least 3 decades, and I'm sure, people have predated this activism to the 80s or even the 70s to me, but certainly since the end of the Civil War and the early opposition to Solidaire, there is a group of individuals who are still to this day involved in this, and others around them. They have taken on these ideas, and they have a real critique of the status quo and a real alternative voiced of how they would govern, on what basis. It's not uniform, and this is one of the things that makes Lebanon so interesting, is that you do have people who argue, mostly in private, but they say how could we no longer have the resistance as the resistance and still protect ourselves from Israel in a reformed Lebanon? And there are people who have ideas about this. How do you make sure that Christians will still be able to survive in the Levant if you no longer have Christian warlords effectively apportioned a higher share of power than their numbers would dictate? And again, I think there's an answer to that in universal rights and real due process. But these are, the real core questions that trip up a reform project. One is the resistance question, because for all the criticism of Hezbollah and its authoritarianism and its sort of self-serving use of this, they really have served as a bulwark against Israeli aggression, and no one in the state appears able or willing to take that role over. And the second one, which is a real elephant in the room, which everyone knows, which is that the Christian share of the population has fallen to maybe 20% of the population, and their share of power is close to 50.
Which points back to the demographics thing that you were referring to, which is that maybe, unfortunately, now, if Lebanon is to behave the way other countries do in the region, societies
right. So the fear is that if you went to a direct democracy, Lebanese Christians would be treated like Iraqi Christians.
Right. But I want to go back to the issue of Hezbollah and just that argument, which is shared among many, that Hezbollah has been that defense against Israel. Would it also be fair to say that the Lebanese state has not even been given that chance in the post-war makeup of the way Lebanon emerged, whether it's under Syrian occupation and indirect rule, or whether
it's a chicken and egg problem, which is that certainly now, or certainly since 2006, there's no opportunity for a genuinely autonomous national Lebanese army to prove itself, because Hezbollah is already within it and above it, and constraining it from being that. And so this is an unwinnable argument, because Hezbollah will say, look at the Lebanese army, it's at the mercy of the U.S. Department of Defense and this and that. It can't really function properly and autonomously, so we have to be here. And the critic of Hezbollah can correctly say the main reason why it can't properly function is because you won't let it. Because you are physically and literally more powerful than it, and you block it from being able to function the way a real national
both parts kind of dictate where we are today to a certain degree, which is that,
And a radical, I don't see how these kinds of breakthroughs would happen, but imagine a radical breakthrough where Hezbollah just has all its fighters join the army, right? Which would, why not? Yeah, I'm sure that would be a problem for the United States, but the idea is that you could do this if there were good faith, right? They could say the way we'll trust the army is by disbanding as an autonomous militia and having our individual fighters and commanders who we trust join the national army under the national army command, and then we know that the army will fulfill that role because there'll be 10,000 people in it who last week were in Hezbollah.
I think there's been over 30 years of dancing around that question, and every stumbling block to that goal was given, was shown.
Yeah, I mean, the reason they won't do it is because they don't want to actually give up that power,
yeah,
right? And that's the last. I mean, maybe we should end on this idea as the one of the cards that this protest movement can play vis-a-vis all the ruling status quo powers, and especially Hezbollah, is a moral challenge and a moral demand. Say, like, these are your words, Syed Hassan Nasrallah, you've said these things over and over for decades. If you believe them, then give us this level of dignity that has been your hallmark. And that means give us a secret ballot, give us actual security, give all of us the electricity that they have in the Dahiya, and access to health care that you get if you're in a certain neighborhood of the Dahiya. Let us all have that. Those are wonderful things. We don't want to take them away from you. We just all should have them.
It's a privilege to have this conversation with you in your office, the Century Foundation, and I just want to end it by saying that I really like what you've done to this office. Not forget the audio equipment and my jealousy of your podcast equipment. I like the lighting. I like even the friendly food, the apples in the corner. I like the physical photos that you've put up, because that you've dated yourself by doing that. And also these little pictures and clocks and signs of your history, your personal history, that's tied to the region.
If I have any knack for interior decorating, I picked it up in Beirut.
Oh, good for you. This is why I like your office then. So, A Privilege to Die and Citizenship and Its Discontents, both worth checking out.
And if any of your listeners have made it this far in your podcast, I encourage you to look for my podcast. You can find it by searching for TCF World, the Century Foundation World, and you can hear our much less frequent and less in-depth than Ronnie's podcast, but
I will link it up to the episode as well. Listen. Yeah, check that podcast out, and hopefully I'll be joining one of your episodes down the road.
Thanks for having me on, Ronnie.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. The books mentioned during the episode, A Privilege to Die and Citizenship and Its Discontents, are linked in the details box, as well as the podcast Thanassis hosts. And once again, if you're enjoying these episodes, kindly consider a contribution through Patreon or PayPal, linked to the details box as well. Any amount is appreciated. Until next time, I'm Ronnie Shatah. This is the Beirut Banyan.